This quest, well, session, will be taking place almost immediately after the last one. So it's pretty much still the day after the the five of you were visited by the Bleeding Man. And he not only forced his way in, but did some kind of serious damage to some of you, as well as no small amount of a threat.
I thought the Bleeding Man incident was before the time skip.
Oh, that's right, that is before the time skip. Hold on a second then. Alright, so this session takes place after last session, which was you found out, I think from Merton that you have 4 days, right?
Yeah.
That being said, all of you kind of have your own things to do. Not all of you are super helpful in tracking down a secret meeting place.
Yeah.
You fall into that category.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, instead, we'll be going through what will be happening. This session is going to take place over the course of roughly a single day. So, like, a full 24 hours. But it's going to go from, like, midday through night to another midday.
Okay.
Okay?
Alright.
So,
it is... really tall moray, it's not exactly stealthy.
Yeah. It is the day of that the lot of you gathered up again, and then split up your various ways. All three of your party members have departed to go take care of other matters, making their final preparations for closing in on Victor and hopefully the Bleeding Man, depending on how things go.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, there's definitely an air of nervousness to the lot of you, as this place nowhere seems safe anymore in this city. Word's been coming in that Beastman raids are growing in intensity and size outside of the city. Word has it that entire war herds are on the move. Although the Skaven threat has been dealt with and a good portion of Western Nolan has been rebuilt, it's still fairly in the early phases. The Eastern Gate has been rebuilt successfully, but the city still feels very vulnerable to many people.
Right.
There's even been refugees flooding in from surrounding villages and small towns, talking about immense hordes and other terrifying things moving around in the night. That being said, thankfully, you're not one of those people.
Right.
So, the party left you in charge of defending the cloister for now, and keeping an eye on Anna, as you're the only one who's actually does not have a supreme amount to do and is not particularly helpful in hunting down your target.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, as you prepare to settle in for a long day, Anna's there with you, obviously. You hear the front door open, and from how quickly it opens and the boom right before, you can tell that it's probably Grog opening the door.
I will go and check what's going on.
Okay. You hear a small amount of conversation from outside, and then in walks a familiar face.
Mikael will bow and say, Theodora?
She nods, and she whispers something you don't catch to Grog, and you hear him respond in kind. And then he closes the door with a soft boom behind her.
What do I owe the pleasure?
She nods to you and says, I don't believe I've ever been able to properly thank you for when you all came to defend the temple.
No need. It's kind of what we do.
She smirks and approaches closer and says, as much as I'm sure that you're the kind of group that tends to just wander into trouble, I think a small conversation of thanks isn't too much of a reward to give.
Mikael will smile back and say, fair enough.
She nods and sort of looks around and raises an eyebrow at a few things as she presses past you into the temple and says, I see that you've added a few amenities.
Mikael gets this look and says, not me.
She gives you a shrewd look, though there's a hint of humor to it, and then nods and says, Well, it seems that you haven't completely... it seems that the integrity of the place is held up somewhat. I trust it's kept you safe.
I did draw the line at the brewery and the forge, I assure you.
She nods and says, I think some of the sisters might have approved of a brewery being added, but they will... I suppose we'll never know the answer to that, will we?
Nope.
She nods and leans against a wall. Some reinforcements have arrived from Altdorf. We have Templars guarding the outer cloister now.
Of who?
She shrugs and says, some knights, some bearing the symbol of Tal, other from Sigmar, reinforcements sent with some of the sisters that came from the capital. Word has it that the Grand Theogenist has his eye on Nuln at the moment, due to all the nasty rumors coming from here.
I wouldn't be surprised that cultists managed to supplant the high priesthood here.
She nods.
Rather irritated.
She nods. Yes, though I think the Countess has been going a little out of her way to ensure that rumors about that stay as that, just rumors.
Indeed.
She pauses for a long time, sort of looks down at the ground, looks back up and says, so, how are you holding up?
Did you hear what I said?
No.
Oh, I said Mikael responds with, it's been difficult at times. Sorry, my sticky keys thing went off.
It's alright. She nods and says, I know that Hulst's death was hard on you. I understand he was a good friend to the lot of you.
That coming so soon after getting thrown out of the temple wasn't exactly easy to deal with.
She nods. She pauses for a time, watching one of the fires burn away, and she turns at you with a fairly serious look on her face, and she says, have I ever told you why I joined the Shalian convent?
I wondered why someone of such high status would, but I didn't think to ask. I didn't think it proper to ask.
She nods and says, my grandfather, you kind of remind me of him, in a good way, in that he was a strong man, independent, faithful to his religion in many ways, stoic, a little stubborn, but he was strong, and he fought to protect people his entire life. That being said, when my grandmother died to an orc raid when he was away, that ended up being his only recourse, was violence.
Mikael will start blinking rather, as if this is having quite the effect on him.
She gives you a small smile and says, vengeance became all he cared about. It literally consumed him. I watched a man who I had loved and who had been good to my own parents descend down into madness. Slowly, but surely. And no one could turn him aside from this path. And although it's a secret that I'm sure the Countess would not be thrilled about me sharing, that rage consumed him, Mikael. He fell to a power, a very dark power, because he couldn't control his anger.
Mikael starts laughing under his breath and goes, seems history repeats.
She shrugs somewhat and says, I can't tell you how to live your life, and I obviously don't know you as well as I would like to, but I would encourage you to perhaps consider a better path than the one I can feel you going down. Nothing wholesome lies down that path.
At this, Mikael will pull out the feather and stare at it and says, I'm getting that feeling myself.
She sort of winces when you pull it out and says, that's quite an artifact you have there. Where did you find that?
It was a gift. From the companion of The late Father Raven spoke.
She sort of smirks and leans back and says, "You do have a strange habit of wandering into unusual situations. You know that, right?"
Some would say that as a doomsayer, it's kind of my obligation to do so.
She smirks and says, "I've met many wandering individuals who would claim such a life, but it seems that you're quite well designed for it. Perhaps Morr chose wisely when he took you on."
He was the only one that would. Not many would take a foundling found on the banks of the River Stir.
She nods, and she frowns at you and says, "Like I said, I don't want to pry, I just... You know that Shalia gifts me with the ability to heal wounds. To heal more than just physical wounds. And I can feel your pain, Mikael. I can see it on you like a shroud. It's winning that fight."
Mikael will pause and look at her and say, "Some scars go very deep. But and then he looks back at the feather. But I have a feeling sometimes it's better to let them to let them be healed as opposed to let them fester."
She nods, smiling sadly, and says, "Yeah, I would agree with that. Rage is a weakness, one that few too many understand. They see it as power or as a strength, when instead all it leads is to madness." She pauses and looks at you for a moment and says, "I know you want vengeance for probably more than just Holst, but for the many people that we've lost in recent times and to all the suffering and pain that we've dealt with."
That and more.
She nods and says, "But I would ask that you try to remain strong in this fight. Not to give in to despair, to hatred. If you must do something with these emotions, then let them be a piercing lance to strike down your enemies with purpose, not a raging conferno that consumes everything around you."
Understood. I've been having thoughts along this line already. The last time I let my rage consume me, my companions ended up paying the price.
She nods and approaches you carefully, and she says, "May I tend to your wounds?"
Mikael nods slowly.
She steps forward and she lays a hand upon your face, and you feel a very cool, calming sensation.
Mikael just patiently waits.
You feel a strange burden seem to almost melt off of you, and suddenly the world still seems dark, but it's a little better. Remove one insanity point.
Okay. Mikael starts blinking.
You cut out.
No. Mikael just starts laughs softly and says, "Sometimes you don't realize the weight of burdens until they..."
Until they what?
He said until they're lifted.
She nods, and her hand rests on your face for a moment. And there almost seems to be a sense of something that you're not really familiar with, just due to the life you've led, in her eyes for a moment, and then she sort of gives you a sad smile and pulls away.
Mikael just sort of nods to her, and he's a bit confused as to the last bit.
She pauses for a moment and sort of rubs one of her arms, and she looks a little drained. And she nods and says, "So, about that reward, I was thinking we could do something fun tomorrow. You, me, and Anna."
Mikael looks back in the room where Anna's in, and he goes, I think that would probably be best. I am not the best when it comes to children. I don't exactly have the fondest experiences with them.
She sort of cocks her head at you and sort of smirks and says, well, in your defense, I don't think someone who had a ripe and joyful childhood would be able to understand that little one very well.
Mine was the exact opposite of that, and I still don't understand her.
She giggles at this and shakes her head, says, regardless, maybe spend some time with her today.
I shall.
She nods and says, then I'll come by tomorrow morning and the three of us can go out. Perhaps we can go shopping or something. I know of some new stores that have been brave enough to open up in the old poor quarter. Rumor has it they're selling some pretty interesting things to pull people back into the area.
I look forward to it.
She nods and says, I'll see you then.
Until tomorrow. He bows.
And she leaves.
Mikael starts walking over to the room with Anna in it.
Okay, you approach the room, and as you enter, you see that she's sitting on her bed, sort of just kicking her legs back and forth.
Everything alright?
She sort of snaps out of her contemplation, looks, and nods and says, yeah, I'm alright, just thinking.
About what?
She shrugs and says, everything that's happened. There are days I wonder if perhaps it would have been better if I had not come here.
To the temple?
She frowns and says, that, and maybe to just Nolan in general.
Perhaps. But but more works in very mysterious paths. Did I ever tell you why I came to Nuln?
She shakes her head.
My entire temple died. Killed by an orc raid.
She sort of smirks at this and says, it seems grandfather tends to have a thing for orphans then, doesn't it?
Indeed. I must apologize to you, Anna. I've been rather neglectful in these past 2 months.
She shakes her head. It's okay, I think I needed some space. Things have been difficult since Hulse passed.
And I have a feeling I didn't exactly make them easier.
She shrugs.
Mikael walks over and sits on the bed across from her. Says, sometimes I wonder if Ravenscloak told me to care for you not so that I could defend you, but the other way around.
She rolls her eyes and says, Ravenscloak was a terrible guardian if it makes you feel better. He was always too busy to be around.
Let's hope I do not continue the trend then.
She gives a soft smile and looks down at the ground. And she looks up at you and her face seems concerned. And she seems like she wants to say something, but she's kind of holding back.
What is it?
Roll a fellowship check. She pauses and looks down at the ground and is fiddling with her thumbs and looks back. She says, Are you ever afraid?
Of what?
She shrugs and says, death? Or monsters? Or pain? Or suffering? Or anything?
Sometimes. Though I find death, I hold less and less fear of death anymore. I fear more for what happens in this life than the next.
She nods, frowning down at the ground still, and she looks up and says, I have never really been afraid of anything. Well, for most of my life. But I guess that's what I'm experiencing now, and I really don't know how to deal with it.
Mikael will walk over and sit down next to her on the bed. What are you feeling?
She leans against you a little bit, and you notice that she's shaking just a tad. And she looks down at the ground and says, you know, you remember that night when he came here?
Yes. Mikael seems rather, ashamed.
She pauses for a moment and says, I haven't been able to dream since he came here.
Mikael looks at her and says, well, to tell you the truth, I haven't dreamed since long before he visited. I haven't dreamed since before Holst's death.
She shakes her head and says, but you don't understand. I've always had dreams. As long as I could remember. Sometimes grandfather would just play with me or tell me things or just spend time with me, but now it's just silence.
Perhaps he thinks that you don't always need him anymore.
She pauses and sighs and says, I mean, I think I still dream, but it's always just this oppressive shadow. And that's all there is. Just an empty wasteland of nothing but darkness. And sometimes I'm scared I can't leave that place.
Mikael will wrap his arm around her and pull her tighter, and pull her closer and say, but yet you always wake up, don't you?
She nods. She's still frowning, but she nods.
One must always remember that although our dreams sometimes tell the future, they also tell us of what, and they don't tell what they tell us is not always set in stone. They are subject to change.
She nods, and she seems a bit more resolved. And she looks up and says, so, what did Theodora want? I could smell her when she came in here. She always wears perfume, which I find kind of weird, but I guess it's whatever.
Well, who knows the reasons why those of noble birth do as they do. She wanted to talk to me, and she wanted to go out shopping with us tomorrow.
She nods and says, that sounds good. And then she sort of smirks mischievously and sticks a fairly sharp elbow into one of your ribs and says, Grandfather told me that she liked you, you know.
Mikael just starts blinking very rapidly, like, what?
At this, she shakes her head and says, you're just as bad as Grandfather Ravencloak was. You know that?
What? Mikael is thoroughly confused.
She shakes her head and says, oh, nothing. Can we go play with Grog? It's been a while since I've played a game with him. He's probably bored.
Anna, when you said like, I'm assuming you meant more than just as a friend, correct? Mikael is slowly starting to comprehend her previous statement.
She rolls her eyes and says, Grandfather approved of it, you know. He's been watching you since you came here.
I'm happy to hear that. It's good to have someone looking out for me.
At this, she pouts a little bit and says, I look out for you, but you never say anything about that.
Mikael will ruffle her hair and says, yes, but that's because I'm supposed to be the aloof older brother figure.
She glares at you for a moment. She says, sometimes I wonder if you're any good at digging out of the holes you make.
Perhaps if I just keep digging, I'll find my way out.
She shakes her head and says, "You and the dwarf have too much in common. That's why I like the elf more."
Mikael gets a very theatrical, hurt expression on his face. He goes, "Hey, I'll have you know I was saved by a dwarf once."
She giggles and says, she giggles for a moment and says, "Well, maybe if you didn't dig so far down, you wouldn't have to have a dwarf dig you out."
Mikael gets this very thoughtful expression on his face and goes, I'll keep that in mind."
She nods and she grabs at your hand and pulls you up. She says, "Come on, we're gonna go play Grog's favorite game. I throw food at him and see if he can catch it with just his mouth in the air."
Okay. Mikael follows her.
The two of you go out and you realize that she was in fact not joking about said game, and it's actually relatively dangerous looking because when Grog stumbles around, if he were to run into anyone, they'd probably be flattened. But thankfully, the damage is minimal. Evening does swiftly approach, though, as the day rolls onwards.
Okay.
Anna retires early, excitedly talking about some of the things that she's interested in looking for in the following day.
Mikael just sort of follows her and smiles and nods at the appropriate places.
Before the two of you separate to your respective rooms, she gives you a strangely hard and long hug that seems to convey some emotion that you're not overtly familiar with.
Mikael returns the hug.
She nods and just tells you goodnight softly and goes to bed.
Mikael watches her, and then when he thinks she's safely in bed, he goes sits next to one of the braziers and pulls out the feather and looks at it again, as if trying to figure out what exactly it is. He has a feeling there's something more to it than just a feather.
As you pull it out, the moment like any of your skin makes contact with it, it like reverberates with energy. And it's almost like your bones are shaking, it's very bizarre.
Can Mikael make like a magical sense check what it like, see if he sees anything like what it is or anything?
You can try. Oh, well, that'll do it. As you focus your otherworldly sight onto the feather, it seems to almost be pulsating with some sort of strange power. And not being very familiar with the winds of magic, you don't really recognize it. It's kind of like... it's a very warm, purplish haze. But it pulses very strongly. The closer it gets to the arrow, the blacker it becomes. But there's something very calm and neutral about it. Like, it seems exceedingly powerful, but it doesn't seem like it's necessarily designed for destruction or creation. It just sort of is. That being said, you can tell that the feather seems to be, like, at its limit, trying to contain whatever power this is.
Can Mikael make like a channeling check to try and touch the power?
If you want to.
I have a feeling this is going to go badly. Yeah.
You reach out, but as you somewhat connect with it, it's very oppressive, and you're almost drained just trying to focus in on it to that intent, and you back away before risking yourself any further.
Mikael pauses and just stares at the feather. Is it lying on the floor now?
No, I'm assuming you're still holding it.
Oh, okay. Well, he just sort of stares at it contemplatively and trying. Can you make a I want to say academic knowledge religion check to see if he's ever read about something like this, or...
Sure. Fair enough. Um, you've never read of anything that's explicitly like it, but based on the readings that you have done over your life, it sounds vaguely similar, like super vaguely similar to certain relics of the way people have described really potent relics of Morr. Things that like contain fragments of his power, but it's very difficult to make that match. And it almost seems like a leap.
I don't suppose trying to read the prayer book would help.
No.
Yeah. Mikael will just kind of get a little frustrated and then just sigh and put the feather away.
Okay.
Then begin walking over to his bed.
Okay. You gonna turn in for the night? Wrong bed.
Alright.
There you go.
Yeah, Mikael will turn in for the night because I can't think of him to do anything else but try and mess with the feather still. That's not going well for him.
Okay. You pass out fairly quickly. But as you descend into the darkness that is the oblivion of sleep, you seemingly almost blink in a weird way, and the next thing you know, you're floating above the city of Nuln.
Like, he's physically present floating above the city of Nuln?
Like, you can't see yourself, but you can see down on Nuln.
Is it the same sort of experience as when he he has his visions?
Yeah, it feels vaguely similar. It's hard to tell if you're dreaming or not.
Okay, Mikael will just start looking around Nuln in a slightly confused fashion.
As you do so, you feel a strange influence pulling you towards the docks.
Mikael will fly, move towards the docks?
Move. The word you're looking for is move.
Move.
As you will yourself to approach the docks, you find that you are quite capable of moving in any direction at almost absurd speeds. And in a matter of seconds, you're suddenly at floating just above the many warehouses that make up the dock district.
Okay.
And as you look over them, you can almost... There's almost... When you focus to the west, and you're right in the center of the docks at the moment, when you focus to like the northwestern portion of the docks, which are closer towards the ruined part of the city, where there are still quite a few buildings that have not been repaired and are burned, you almost hear it almost sounds like someone is from very far away is dragging their nails on chalkboard.
And Mikael will head for that area.
Okay, as you approach, you come to two lines of warehouses that are mostly identical. Almost all of them have some form of damage and have probably been abandoned. But as you get this close, that screeching sound is becoming quite loud. And you begin to hear what you swear is... You hear someone giggle behind you, but every time you turn to look at it, there's nothing there, and then you swear you hear laughter again coming from another direction, just out of your vision.
Can Mikael make, magical sense to try and locate it with his other senses?
You can try. You'll be at a pretty severe penalty. No.
Okay.
That being said, what's your willpower?
50.
Okay, just checking. That being said, oh, good for you then. One of the warehouses in particular, on the second row, the second to the right, is whenever you look at it, you have a very foreboding sense of purpose.
Mikael will head towards that warehouse.
Roll a willpower check. As you start to head towards it,
Can I fortune point this?
yes, you may. Okay. As you head towards it, you hear the giggles start to get louder and more present, and there are shadows at the edge of your vision. But you manage to remain focused, and you keep heading towards this particular warehouse, and until you're standing outside of its large door.
Mikael will steady himself and push open the door.
Okay, roll a willpower check. Alright, you step forward and you don't push open the door, but instead you rather phase through it. And as you do so, the first thing that catches your attention is up on the wall is an image of a giant swordfish burned into the wall, like some sort of emblem that identified this particular building at some point.
Okay.
And the warehouse is empty, but you feel like this is an extremely dangerous environment. And every time you so much as blink, there are little, you swear shadows are moving.
Mikael will slowly withdraw from the warehouse.
Okay.
Actually, but as he's going, can I throw a magical sense check and see if he can't pinpoint the shadows?
You can.
Nope. Okay.
Every time you try and focus on them, they flit away. But you begin to feel a very strong coldness slowly overwhelming your body as you start to back away.
Mikael, I'm assuming Mikael can't pull out his weapon since he's in a dream.
Yes, you do not have a body.
Yeah. Mikael will try and continue to leave, even though he has a feeling of what's happening.
Alright, you attempt to flee. Roll a willpower check. Okay. You, as you start to pull away, you hear the sound of footsteps coming from all around, and you swear you can hear claw marks resonating on stone. But remaining once more reminded of your purpose to leave, you quickly ascend back into the sky as quickly as you can, and as the coldness starts to fade, you feel relatively safe as you soar very quickly back up into the sky. And just as you feel a resounding, like, for sure that you're safe, you hear an eerie laughter, and suddenly everything goes black. You wake up.
Okay.
And it is morning.
Mikael will surge to his feet because he's rather alarmed.
Okay, as you do so, you realize that your left arm is almost entirely numb, but as you regain consciousness and awareness, it goes back to being normal.
Mikael will look at his left arm and mutter about how strange.
Okay, and as you awake, you can hear Anna shuffling around, and you peer through one of the high-arcing windows in the temple to realize that it's morning.
Mikael will walk out into the main area of the thing. Temple. That's the word. Temple.
Okay, and rather conveniently, as you do so, you hear the door softly open, and you see Theodora slip her way in, trying to be quiet.
Mikael will walk out and look and nod to her.
She nods back to you with a smile, and she has a basket. And as she approaches, you can smell something quite heavenly coming from said basket.
Mikael just... I'm assuming Mikael can put two and two together that this is food.
Well, he's not an idiot, so I would hope so.
Yeah. You brought food?
She nods and says, just a small little breakfast before we head out. We don't want to spend all of our money on food, now do we?
Mikael.
Anna, upon smelling the food, comes rushing out, and she looks rather alarmed. And when she sees Theodora, she goes, oh, thank God. I don't think I can take any more of the dwarf's dry rations.
Mikael has this oh crap moment because he forgot to buy her actual food like he was planning on it.
Theodora gives you an amused look and says, I thought you were supposed to be the girl's warden. That does include keeping her alive by avoiding starvation, does it not?
I've been gone for that. And Mikael gets a very sheepish look and goes, I've been gone for the past 2 months.
She shakes her head and says, well, luckily for you that this child is able to provide for herself.
Hey, I left a babysitter. He motions towards the door.
Anna nods and says something, but her mouth is already full of some very freshly made rolls. And Theodora nods at her garbled words and raises an eyebrow and says, you trusted an ogre with a child?
Hey, the child is more blessed by my god than I am. And besides, you have not seen that ogre fight.
She raises an eyebrow and she says, you know, there are some who would say that's precisely the problem.
Mikael gets another rather sheepish look on his face.
She rolls her eyes and sticks her hand into the basket and pulls out some rolls that have some very high quality, like it's very high quality food. And she hands you a few of them.
Mikael begins eating, I guess.
Yep. The three of you enjoy a fairly nice meal, and as you finish up and Theodora places everything left over back in the basket, she nods at the three of you and says, well then, should we get going?
Indeed. He looks at Anna. Are you ready?
Anna seems extremely pumped.
Mikael smiles and then motions towards the door.
Alright, the three of you head out. And Theodora strongly suggests that you head to the new refurbished poor quarter.
Okay. Mikael will follow that suggestion.
Alright, after about 30 minutes of just walking through the city, you arrive. It's a beautiful day out. It's quite nice, the weather's nice, and quite a few people are about on business. The city feels almost normal for once.
Does Mikael recognize any of the people from when he spent time doing all the work doing with the dead?
No, most of the people who are out in this part aren't actually. This is more of like a used to be the poor quarter. A lot of the merchants you see here are at least mid class, if not higher. Most of the poor have moved into the west portion of Nuln for the moment until some more construction is done. But Nuln is actually doing quite well economically from the increased growth from rebuilding a portion of the city.
But is this the marketplace where they had the encounter?
Yes, a very long time ago, yeah.
Right,
Almost 3 months ago.
Mikael will look around and say, this place has been rebuilt nicely.
Theodora nods and says, yes, they've done quite a nice job, which is good. Anna very excitedly runs off to the stall over here and starts just messing with things. One of the merchants gives her like a eye about whether or not she's a thief, but upon seeing you and Theodora, he nods to himself and goes back to his work.
Mikael just keeps walking alongside Theodora while keeping an eye on Anna.
Theodora rolls her eyes and says, you know, for a child that's supposedly marked by the death god, she does have a rather unnatural amount of energy, doesn't she?
Yes, that was quite unnerving when first we met.
She smirks and nods and says, it's quite good for you then that you met her. I can't imagine how in your shell you were before you had to deal with her.
Mikael goes, put it this way, I had to have some sense slapped into me by a dwarf.
She smirks and says, you know, I've met a few too many people who seem to say that these days. One wonders who does the smacking for the dwarves.
Considering the length and color of his beard, I assumed he had gone through his share of slapping from other dwarves when he was younger.
She giggles at the idea and nods and says, nonetheless, he seems to be keeping you all in relatively good health.
Does she think it's the same dwarf that he's traveling with?
Yes, she does.
Mikael blinks and goes, oh no, different dwarf. Wrong side of the empire for it to have been Morrick.
She raises an eyebrow and says, 2 dwarves? You do get around.
I walked all the way here to Nuln from Ostermark.
She shakes her head with a smirk at the joke soaring over your head.
Mikael has this moment of realization and looks at her as if it's like, wait a minute.
She shrugs and then jogs ahead to see what Anna's looking at.
Mikael sighs and curses his own. Oh, actually, no. He just sighs and follows her.
Okay. You spend a good portion of the day wandering around the market, checking out various things. Anna constantly pesters you to buy the occasional thing. She wants candy from one vendor, a toy from this vendor, which is a bit unusual for her. Though she hovers overtly long at one of the steel vendors before Theodora very briskly shoos her off from it.
Mikael will glance at the steel vendor to see what it was they're selling.
He had some very long-handled knives, supposedly from Araby. If anything, they look more wicked than the knife she currently has.
Are they better than Mikael's current dagger?
Probably, but calling them a dagger is a little bit generous.
Yeah. Mikael shakes his head at Anna's choice of what's the word?
Aesthetics?
Yeah, aesthetic. Yeah, and then just keeps walking.
Theodora does buy Anna a couple of small things that she wants. You notice her purse is definitely not hurting. And after Anna gets a few things, she stops over at this particular vendor over here. And as you both approach, you and her seem to both lock your eyes on the same time at this very, very nicely crafted amulet that is made seemingly out of some sort of silver. And yet, what it is it's a circle that has a raven embroiled in the center that's held, throughout the circle. And then in the raven's claws is clutched a rose and the actual rose part has been made of some kind of strange black stone to emulate a black rose.
Mikael will walk up to the vendor and ask how much for the amulet.
He frowns and raises an eyebrow and says, "Kind of a dark buy for just a gentleman wandering around with his family, don't you think?"
Mikael will get this, have this moment of slight shock that doesn't quite register to his face, and says, "Not exactly a dark buy for a Morrite, though."
Theodora walks up next to you and smirks at the man as he seems to glance between the two of you, frowning heavily. And he shakes his head and says, "I don't really want to know any further. Fine, you can have it for, say, 5 gold. It was quite a rare find, I must admit. I picked it up in Middenheim when I was up there on some business."
Mikael will nod and pay him the 5 gold.
He nods and hands it to you, and you are getting some very, very envious looks from one particular individual.
Mikael will just sort of smile at Anna.
She glares at you, and Theodora, not so subtly, elbows you hard in the ribs.
He just sort of holds it out for her.
Anna grins, and she takes it, and she seems very satisfied with it. And she sort of smirks to herself, and then sees something else going on and runs off to investigate. And Theodora sighs and leans against this statue here, which has been built in the image of Sigmar to hopefully protect this plaza from further incidents. And she looks over at you and says, "Well, that was kind of you."
Yeah, I was planning on giving it to her anyways.
She frowns at you and says, I almost wonder if Frederick purposely picked you because he knew you would be a terrible guardian. You give the girl anything she wants."
Mikael laughs and pulls out his necklace, which has the same actual thing of a raven clutching a black rose, and goes, "I already have one. It's just not as nice."
She shakes her head and says, "A lot can be said about Morrites, but I almost wonder if those who claim you're unoriginal aren't exactly incorrect."
Mikael just laughs. And then he looks over to see what Anna's up to.
She's just messing with wares.
Then he leans against the statue, and it's like, a lot more pleasant than the last time I was here.
She nods and says, Yes, I think it's more pleasant than the last time any of us were over here. I'm glad we got to have this day, if nothing else.
Yes. It's nice to see Anna happy. She's been far too somber of late.
Theodora nods and says, "You're brave, you know, to let yourself get attached to a child like that. I would be quite frankly amazed if she makes it to, you know, our age."
I made it.
She nods and says, "Ah, yes, but you don't have a god of morbidity constantly hovering over your shoulder."
No, but I did have an entire town that dedicated to hating me.
She nods and says, "It's not humans I worry about."
I know. But anything that, human or not, that's what I'm for.
She nods, and she actually leans against you for a moment, and then she sort of giggles to herself and says, "You know, I don't think that man was completely wrong. We don't make a terrible family image, even if it's not exactly the case."
The father at my temple always said I did have a thing for Shalians.
She laughs and shakes her head. She says, "Do you know how many men have died trying to flirt with one of the sisters?"
Actually, I do. I spent quite a bit of my childhood in the temple of Shalia. I was such a frequent customer that they just sort of left the door open for me.
She smiles and shakes her head and says, "I would say I'm surprised, but I suppose I'd be lying, and that is technically not what Shalia prefers."
The mother at the temple always used to joke that about the phrase, it's like, date the daughter, meet the father, except for in my case I already served the father, so it didn't matter.
You both laugh at this semi-terrible joke. And you see Anna giving you a very suggestive look from over where she is, but she notices you're looking, goes back to pretending to be looking for things.
I think Anna expects us to do something.
Theodora smirks and says, "Ah, yes, well, she's going to have to be patient then, isn't she?"
She seemed rather intent on beating her thoughts over my head repeatedly last night.
Theodora sighs and says, "In my experience with you, Mikael, that's the only way to get anything through to you."
Mikael just gets this kind of hurt look and goes, "I'm working on it, okay?"
She rolls her eyes and says, "You know, it's a good. I almost worry that your god isn't one of the kind that grants immortality, because you may need it at this rate."
Oh, really? He leans closer to her.
She raises her eyebrows in surprise, and then laughs, and quicker than you would have imagined, she actually reaches forward and gives you a slight kiss on the lips before backing away immediately.
Mikael blinks for a moment and goes, I may be rather ignorant of these things, but I'm not dead."
She shakes her head smiling, and you see Anna give you a rather well-hidden small thumbs up.
Mikael just starts is trying rather hard and partially failing to not laugh.
At this point, you sort of sit and just enjoy the weather for a bit, and then all of you sort of notice that people seem to be very busily coming from the east and hustling towards the west.
Mikael looks and says, "I wonder what's going on."
Theodora frowns, and she stands up and looks down the street, and she waits for you to get up and says, "We may need to leave."
Mikael walks next to her.
You see a rather alarming amount of blackguard coming down the street.
Lovely. Anna, I think it's time for us to leave.
Anna looks in that direction, and she frowns and comes up behind the two of you. And as you step away to try and consider leaving for a moment, you see you're getting some rather dangerous looks from the gnome guards positioned around the area.
Mikael sighs. Lovely.
Theodora sort of smirks and grabs you by the arm and says, "Well, I suppose they want us to wait then."
Indeed.
After a few minutes, a lot of the people around the area see the approaching guard and quickly make themselves scarce.
Mikael motions Theodora and Anna to move out of the street.
They both very strongly refuse.
Mikael sighs and then just stands his ground.
It only takes a few more minutes for them to approach, and you see a familiar, angry face among them.
Sigmund?
He scowls as you say his name, and he says, "Ah, I've been looking for you, rat."
You seem to have found me.
He frowns at the High Priestess of Shalia for a moment, and then sort of shakes his head and turns his attention back to you and says, "As I'm to understand it, you disobeyed an edict I set out from the temple."
As I understood it, the edict was for members of the Temple of Morr of Nuln. I am of the Temple of Morr in Ostermark.
He narrows his eyes and says, "You defy my authority in my city, whelp."
Is it to defy authority to fulfill one of our cult's holiest strictures?
He steps forward, scowling from his guard, and says, "It is if it defies me."
Mikael steps forward and says, "So you place yourself above our god, then?"
He reaches down and puts a hand on his sword hilt and says, "I should gut you where you stand for such insolence. You know nothing of our god. You're merely a pretending beggar that wanders from place to place."
Mikael just smiles and says, then strange how frequently I receive dreams from him, then."
He scoffs and says, "Any beggar can receive dreams, as you put it. You haven't received word, have you, that we've received interesting letters from augurs scattered all around Nuln, who've had dreams of a man quite fitting your description burning down our very temple?"
Strange. I've had visions of everything but the temple being burned.
He scowls and says, "Perhaps you're the one who sets light to such things, then, heretic. You see that normally the Blackguard tend to take a rather impassive look towards you, but many of them are giving you very, very hateful looks."
Mikael just sort of stares Sigmund down.
Sigmund matches your stare and says, "I've sent word, you know, around the Empire. Word to all of the other cloisters of Morr that you're to be recognized and cast out from our order, seeing as you intend to attack us when we least expect it, and our time of need when the city is burning."
Says the man who would violate our strictures for coin.
He steps forward and is almost chest to chest with you and says, if you insult me one more time, I swear by Morr I will send you to his realm right now."
We both know that true men of Morr have no fear of death.
Theodora presses up beside you a bit and she says, "Ah, yes, well, as exciting as that may be, I have use for both of you staying alive at the moment."
Mikael looks to Theodora, nods, and takes a step back.
Sigmund glares at her for a moment and backs up as well. And Anna reaches over and tugs on your cape, very strongly seeming to express a need that you need to go. And Sigmund's eyes are drawn down and he sees her and his eyes narrow and says, "You." And he makes a gesture, and all of a sudden, all the members of the Blackguard step forward with their weapons drawn.
Mikael goes for his axe.
Sigmund reaches down for his sword and says, "I should have known you were harboring this this assassin?
It was Ravenscloak. It was in Ravenscloak's will that I take care of her.
He spits on the ground and says, Ravenscloak was losing his mind from old age when he finally passed. It's no wonder that a heretic like yourself took advantage of this. Not to mention that, but you're harboring his killer. Is that why you've been hiding up in the Temple of Shalya all this time? To defend a little murderer? Anna is, like, burying herself into you, and Theodora, she seems to reach under her cloak for something.
Mikael gets visibly enraged and says, I would say that the man who stabbed his neck with the warp stone was the killer, not the one that ended his suffering.
He scowls and says, by the time we found his body, after you had tampered with it, I might add, it all seemed very convenient that Ratman had killed such a hero. Nay, I believe it was you, Mikael. One who could have gotten close to him. One who could have... one that he would have allowed his guard to slip down during, so you and this little imp could slit his throat.
Mikael starts shaking with anger at this accusation.
Sigmund gestures, and all of his crossbowmen load bolts, and he steps back a little bit and says, how about you come with us then? See if you can stand the interrogation of the witch hunters. We'll see if you're lying or not.
At this point, Mikael will slowly draw forth the feather and try a channel check.
Okay. You definitely feel its power resonating, but as you pull at it and you start to gain a little bit of mastery over it, you feel Anna's both of her arms lock around your arm holding the feather, and she buries her head into you and shakes her head very fervently.
Mikael will sigh and let go of the power.
As the Blackguards start to surround and get ready to approach, and Sigmund seems to be grinning, suddenly you hear footsteps behind you, and a bunch of bodies in familiar armor push their way in front of you. And one of these individuals, wearing the iconography of the Black Wolf, says, well, we heard there was a bit of trouble over here.
Mikael just smiles and goes, thank you. Yes, we were having a sort of a heated conversation.
Sigmund scowls and says, get out of the way, mercenaries. These individuals are coming with me. One of the Black Wolves hawks a loogie and spits it at Sigmund's feet and says, oi, Captain, what do you think of this? And you hear thunderous footsteps coming from behind you.
Mikael just starts smiling.
Rolf scowls and not so gently pushes his way to the front and gets right up in Sigmund's face.
Mikael looks down at Anna and gives a reassuring smile.
Anna nods, and Rolf stomps up to Sigmund and says, if you lay one finger on one of my men, I swear to Sigmar, Tal, and Raya that I will cut you down where you stand, Sigmund. Sigmund is red in the face, like almost purple with rage. And he reaches down to grab his sword, but so does Rolf, and Rolf seems very calm, although his body seems ready to spring at any moment. At this, Sigmund sort of pauses for a moment, and then he slowly backs up and gestures and says, I have more men than you. I outnumber you, and I have no problem cutting you down. At this, Rolf laughs and says, you haven't heard, have you? We've actually set up a small outskirt post here to deal with things. All of you hear bowstrings being drawn. You see archers on the roof of the building just south of you, all aiming at Sigmund.
Mikael gives an acknowledgement-tary nod to the guys on the roof.
Rolf glares at Sigmund, and Sigmund sort of puffs out his chest again and says, That little imp is wanted for information about the assassination of Father Ravenscloak, one of the grandest high priests of Morr. Rolf holds up his hand and says, honestly, I don't give a shit. The thing is, Mikael is technically a member of the Black Wolves, and thus falls under my authority. And Anna, he says, glaring back at the girl for a moment, and his gaze seems softened a little bit. Anna has been a good friend to the Black Wolves. In fact, over the last 2 months, she has been helping out quite a bit with our dead and wounded.
Mikael turns and looks at Anna and with a face of, you have something you should be telling me.
Anna doesn't look at you. And Rolf scowls at Sigmund, who, after a long, tense moment, slowly releases the grip on his sword and gestures, and his men start to fall back a bit.
Mikael looks up from Anna, but his face is a lot more serious than it was when he was reassuring Anna.
Sigmund glares at all of you and says, this is done for now, but I assure you, this isn't over. Rolf crosses his arms and takes a few steps forward, closer to Sigmund, and doesn't say anything, and Sigmund backs up a tad and says, you just wait till I inform Captain Eckhart about... And before he can finish his sentence, Rolf steps forward and slams his fist straight into Sigmund's face, and the High Priest of Morr goes sprawling back into some of his men, who catch him. Rolf draws his sword at this point, which seems to pulse with light, and just waits. And Sigmund, with a black eye forming, shouts something that none of you can understand just due to the sheer rage behind it, and then says, we're leaving! Now! And all of the Black Guard, including Sigmund, fall back.
Mikael releases his grip on his axe.
Rolf sighs and sheathes the sword and nods to his men, who all nod to Anna and you before going back to their stations.
Mikael steps forward to Rolf and says, my thanks, Rolf. That would have gotten a bit ugly.
He turns and frowns and says, you've been making some enemies that you don't need to be having.
When men of faith and men who pretend to have faith interact, there can be no peace between them.
He nods and says, be that as it may, you should probably avoid stoking his fires while you're trying to defend a Shalyan and a child, Mikael.
I tried, and then he seemed quite willing to stoke his own fires.
Theodora approaches and says, let's be honest, we all know he was going to attack no matter what. Rolf sighs and takes off his helmet and runs a hand through his black hair and sort of looks up at the three of you and says, nonetheless, I would appreciate it if you went home.
I think that is for the best as well.
He nods and says, so, you're keeping Anna with you then? I was wondering where she was hiding out. She wouldn't tell us.
She is. Ravenscloak in his will made her my ward.
He shakes his head and says, I don't know why Ravenscloak picked you instead of the Black Wolves. He did found our damn order, after all. You figured he'd have a little trust in us.
Mikael blinks at this and says, perhaps he was trying to drive me to you.
He shrugs and says, regardless, you've done us proud this day, Mikael, I suppose. At least you're picking the right kinds of enemies. I can't stand that son of a bitch, or Captain Eckhart, though I'm sure I'll be dealing with the latter sooner rather than later.
And I have a feeling the former will just keep being a pain in my ass until he is dealt with.
He nods and says, that being said, I think you've killed enough high priests for now.
Mikael nods and says, shall we? It looks at the others and it looks at Anna and Theodora and says, shall we return then?
They both nod. As the three of you begin to make your way out, Rolf says, Mikael, a moment.
Mikael nods to the two of them and returns to Rolf.
He pauses for a moment and says, so, you hired guards to defend the girl, didn't you?
That was my intention, yes. I was more worried about Anna than the wealth. So I think my companions disagree.
He sighs and pinches the bridge of his nose and says, "You know, if you idiots would be more forthcoming with information sometimes, you probably would find life a little bit easier."
Yes, well, considering we have a chaos sorcerer, a cultist aspiring to be a high priest, and Skaven come after the girl, I thought secrecy might be a bit of a better thing than announcing her presence.
Rolf actually genuinely laughs at this comment, which is a bit alarming because you've never seen him laugh before. And he shakes his head and says, "If you live in a major city in the Empire long enough, I promise you, my friend, those concerns are just everyday affairs."
Mikael blinks and says, "I will never understand you city people."
Rolf shrugs and says, "Personally, I envy you having grown up in the country, but alas, let's get to the point. Since you're keeping Anna there, and she is technically a ward of the Black Wolves, as much as Frederick may not have officially said it, I'll be..." He sort of seems to fumble over the words for a moment, and then just sighs and says, "Don't worry about paying Grog and the others. I'll take care of that."
Mikael nods and says, "Ravenscloak founded the Black Wolves, then?"
He shrugs and says, "Yeah, we formed primarily as a group to guard him while he was on his various adventures. Well, obviously I wasn't alive then, but Frederick made a powerful order out of us. Well, mercenary band. Though he made explicitly certain that we're not technically Morite by any association."
Mikael holds up the prayer book and says, "He gave me this too." Well,
Rolf shrugs and says, "I didn't really know Ravenscloak as a Priest of Morr. He was just a friend to me."
I knew him as the former and wished he was the latter.
He raises an eyebrow and then shakes his head and says, "Regardless, get going. I don't want you running into any more trouble."
Understood. Mikael, for the first time, he actually bows respectfully to Rolf and then turns and walks away.
Rolf nods and yells after you, "And tell that damn dwarf I'm not refunding any of the past 3 months of payment."
Mikael laughs and says, I'll be sure to pass the message. Also, that drinking offer still stands."
Rolf scowls and then walks back into the building the Black Wolves have temporarily taken.
Mikael rejoins the group.
Okay, you return to the the Shalian convent without incident.
Mikael walks in and sighs and goes, "Why can't we just have a normal day?"
Theodora sort of laughs and says, "Personally, I'm quite glad it had a little excitement. I've never actually seen Sigmund get hit before."
I must say, that was quite likely the highlight of my week. I hate the bastard.
Anna nods with a determined look on her face at this assessment. Theodora rolls her eyes and says, "I don't think technically I'm supposed to condone violence, but I will admit it was a little satisfying."
I will condone it for you, Theodora.
She sighs and she leans down and gives Anna a hug for a minute. And then she stands and looks at you and sort of smiles and says, "Well, I should be going then. There's quite a bit of work that needs doing at the convent."
Mikael will walk her to the door and give her a hug as she goes to leave.
She returns it, and it lasts for no small amount of time. And she embraces you very strongly, and as she pulls away, she gives you a worried look and says, "I don't know what's going to happen next, but please, try not to die."
I told Sigmund that Morites have no fear of death. But there is things that we still would like to live for, so worry not. I will not go rushing into death unless absolutely necessary.
She nods and very tenderly strokes your face for a moment and then turns very quickly and leaves.
Mikael watches her leave and then before turning and walking back to Anna.
As the door is shutting, you hear her chastising Grog over not playing stupid games with Anna, and you hear him grumbling and apologetically.
Mikael just starts laughing under his breath and walks up to Anna and says, "Why did you stop me from using the feather?"
She frowns up at you for a moment, and she points to the feather and says, "You can't use it like that."
How can I use it then?
She seems to look around and has a frown on her face, as if she's concentrating extremely difficult. And she points to one of the braziers. She says, "You see that?"
Mm-hmm.
She says, "Okay, so that's a big fire, right? Lots of heat and power."
Right.
She goes, "Now, imagine if I tried to take all of that and just put it into the dwarf's mug."
Would not go well.
She nods and says, "Right, because I can't fit that much into such a small container."
So if I tried to use all this power in the feather, it would not fit in me.
She shrugs and says, I don't think you can wield it like that. It's supposed to go in something, but that feather won't work. It's too small a vessel."
In something.
She nods and says, "Morr gave you a gift. Grandfather gave you a gift. Maybe talk to someone who could do something with it." She sort of smirks up at you and says, "Because unfortunately, last I checked, you're not super useful outside of swinging a hammer around."
Mikael lifts up his thing and says, "It's an axe now. I lost the hammer."
She rolls her eyes and says, "So you can't even do that right."
He goes, I wonder why I like you so much sometimes.
She pats you on the arm in sympathy and says, "It's okay. We all know you're not exactly the brightest one here."
Mikael just putters under his breath.
She shakes her head and says, "Well, I'm going to go do some cleaning, because I know that's what Hulse would have told me to do, and I'm thinking that..." She sort of looks around to make sure he's not here. I don't think Meriton bathes very much."
Mikael takes a moment, thinks on it, and then goes, so that's what that smell was.
She nods and says, "Well, that, plus I sometimes put, like, things that I find in his bed. I don't think he's noticed yet."
Mikael just, bursts out laughing and says, "I thought that was the elf."
She shakes her head with a grin. She says, "I only do it because I know that I can get away with it, because the elf will get blamed. But don't tell the elf. If Evandrel finds out, she'd probably hang me from my pinky toes, and I don't want to experience that."
Mikael laughs. I will keep it as quiet as if I had sworn the oath of silence the Blackguard do."
She nods, and then she heads off to get her usual cleaning stuff. And you see her glancing at Meriton's bed mischievously, and you have a very foreboding sense that she wasn't exactly kidding when she gave that earlier statement.
Mikael laughs and goes, "Anna, you are aware that somewhere around here he has a bag of very hot spices, yes?"
She looks at you, and you see a very devilish idea start to go into her head. Like, you can physically almost see it manifesting.
Considering what those spices did to the Skaven, I can't wait to see the result of what happens to Merton.
She nods, and she pats your arm appreciatively, and then goes rummaging through everyone's stuff, since they're not here.
Mikael laughs, and then sits down and starts thinking about what would make a suitable vessel.
Okay. And that's the end of this session.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for watching. See you next time.